There once was a book, and this book spawned a short-lived TV show. In the book, there was a character, and the character's method of defeating his enemy was in his backstory. In the backstory of this character, his father had made him read a magic book that told him how to defeat his greatest enemy. And his father made him memorize this book. And then his father made him burn the book. Fast forward several years, maybe a decade, to when someone decides to adapt this novel into a TV show. And in the very first couple episodes, the protagonist gets a hold of this magic book. And before the end of the second episode closes out, the protagonist ends up burning the book before he read a single word. Now, what was this show? What was this book? What was this novel? The novel was Wizard's First Rule by Terry Goodkind. The book that was the magical book in the story was the Book of Counted Shadows. The protagonist, his name was Richard Cipher, and the show was called The Legend of the Seeker. Now, why am I talking about this book, this show, this character? Well, a few minutes into my theater visit, when I went to go watch The Last Jedi, I watched the continuation of The Force Awakens. It's like it continued right from where it left off. Rey is standing on a cliff, on an island, facing Luke Skywalker. She's handing him the first lightsaber he ever owned. A lightsaber that had been lost for decades. And upon receiving this Jedi weapon, Luke Skywalker tosses it over his shoulder towards the ocean before them. So what I'm going to talk about right now is the worst thing that everyone's favorite lemon-headed director did to Luke Skywalker and the Star Wars franchise as a whole. I related that earlier fact or experience of The Legend of the Seeker and Wizard's First Rule because burning the Book of Counted Shadows before Richard Cipher ever read a single word within the pages was the worst thing, symbolically and narratively, that Sam Raimi could have done to his show. And basically, the reasons why are the exact same reasons that Rian Johnson had Luke Skywalker toss his lightsaber over his shoulder. In The Legend of the Seeker, this action was symbolic. That Sam Raimi was throwing out the book. He was throwing out Wizard's First Rule. He was not going to follow the events of that novel. His show was going to be episodic. He was going to tell his own story using the characters that Terry Goodkind had developed. And this is very, very similar to what Rian Johnson was doing with The Last Jedi, when he had Luke Skywalker toss his own lightsaber, his father's lightsaber, the gift that Obi-Wan had given him, over his shoulder, probably intending for it to land in the ocean. But it was more than just him going his own way. We see in later events in the movie that not only did Luke figuratively toss aside the past and everything that the Jedi had meant to him, but there was also that instance where he had gotten it into his head to burn down the Jedi archives that had been curated by other people for thousands of years before he ever arrived there. But figuratively, symbolically, and narratively speaking, he was basically making the statement that the past doesn't matter. It's inconsequential. In fact, Yoda so much as says, when he's referring to the books within the archive, that they were boring. In essence, saying that the original trilogy was boring, and that's why I'm throwing it out. That's what Luke Skywalker's character pretty much culminated to. before he made it onto former rebel base at the end of the film. Basically, his heroic death at the end of the movie was quite inconsequential in refuting the symbolic commentary they were offering by tossing the lightsaber behind his back, burning down the archives, simply because his death and departure from Star Wars was basically the final say that, hey, the past has nothing to offer the present. He didn't teach Rey anything. She was there to teach him a lesson. Basically, the narrative in this movie was that Jedi training is a waste of time. It always has been. Anakin and all the people he trained with and all the people who trained before him were wasting their time with all these rules and regulations. I mean, he could have been made a Jedi 2 days after he arrived at the Jedi Temple if he had decided not to listen to the Jedi Masters. Is the hilarious thing. I mean, there's absolutely no reason why he couldn't have been like that kid at the very end of the movie with the broom. Except for he had these people holding him, these Jedi Masters holding him back from achieving that sort of mastery, and then he basically wasted 13 years away from his mother, away from the woman he loved, and he had a terrible life. So this movie just sort of justified his turn to the dark side in the prequels. If you think about it, the Jedi were just terrible to this guy, you know. They weren't teaching him to avoid the dark side at all. At least that's what, you know, the figurative narrative of The Last Jedi would have you believe, is you're just as likely to turn to the dark side with Jedi training as you are without it. You know, so I just think that tossing aside the past that way, they're also tossing aside the fan base that came to Star Wars because of what happened in the prequels and because of what happened in the original trilogy. And I've never really seen a franchise so blatantly depart from its past while at the same time not retconning the past as it does so. Let's take, you know, Highlander, for instance. Christopher Lambert played Connor McLeod, the Highlander. And then there was sort of the Highlander TV show, which Christopher Lambert took part in at least one episode. Okay, and those two, the movies and the TV show, sort of ran together somewhat, although distantly. And then ever since the show went off, and the movies have been really bad, there's been talks of rebooting everything, right? So the past in that sense, in that kind of reboot, wouldn't matter. But I think people would accept that because that's what a reboot is supposed to be all about. Star Wars is not rebooting the original trilogy. They're just throwing it out with the garbage. That original trilogy, those characters, Luke Skywalker, still Mark Hamill. Those characters still exist as everyone has always remembered them. Except now Star Wars is saying, that stuff back then was terrible. And we're going to make some drastic changes in the days to come. That's why what they've done, what Rian Johnson has done, what J.J. Abrams, Kathleen Kennedy, and whoever else is involved has done is, with Luke Skywalker, is the worst thing they could have done to Star Wars, symbolically and narratively. Anyone who, you know, looks close enough at exactly what happened and what has been happening since The Force Awakens can tell that the writing is on the wall. I don't really have to do too much speculation here to really understand that when they portray Luke and Han both as characters who would leave behind their wife and their sister to face her son, you know, to be on opposite sides of a war effort against her son, they would leave her by herself to do that. That they're basically saying, yeah, we know better than George Lucas did when he developed the Star Wars, when he first developed the Star Wars universe, and when he exited the Star Wars universe with the prequels and everything. And we're not going to follow his philosophy of doing things. Now, it is interesting that they hired Rian Johnson, and his philosophy of which direction to take the Star Wars universe in some ways was very similar to George Lucas, such as you don't try to please the fans because you can't please the fans. You try to please yourself with whatever you do. The Force Awakens was reportedly approached in a very different way. And, of course, I've made a video on this. George Lucas is the one who says that with The Force Awakens, Disney wanted to please the fans. So it's just a very interesting situation. This video has gone on quite long, so I'm going to end it soon. But yeah, I was just interested in what you guys thought about the symbolic nature of throwing the lightsaber over Luke's shoulder, burning down the Jedi library, and basically Luke not teaching Rey a single thing.
Remember, I compared these actions by Disney, by Rian Johnson, to Sam Raimi's Legend of the Seeker TV show, and pointed out that that was a short-lived TV show. It was basically a failure. In their day, the books that The Legend of the Seeker was based off of were quite popular. Now, am I saying that Star Wars is going to fail now that Rian Johnson has done terrible things to Luke Skywalker and Star Wars as a whole? No, I'm not saying it's going to fail. But it is going to be far less popular into the future. It's more than likely going to build a whole new fan base and have fluctuating popularity in the days to come, days and years and everything. But my advice to them would be to check themselves.
Anyway, you guys have a great one, and may the Force be with you. Lord knows, it should be with somebody.